Well, a century on, what would the suffragettes think of modern-day feminism? With me now are the journalist and author Radhika Sangani and Ella Whelan, assistant editor of the online magazine Spiked and author of What Women Want, Fund Freedom and an End to Feminism. And with that title, Ella, I have to start with you. What do you think the suffragettes might have made of the state of feminism today?
Do you know, I think that they wouldn't be too impressed, and the reason I say that is because certainly my heroine, the woman I hold in great esteem, Sylvia Pankhurst, a lot of the radical ideas that she held are being undermined today, I think, unfortunately, sometimes by contemporary feminists. The idea that women should be, not protected by the state. Sylvia was herself an enemy of the state, rejecting all kind of intervention from men in terms of women's private lives. And today, contemporary feminism usually, unfortunately, again, argues for, intervention in terms of policing women's behaviour to protect them from men, panicking about women's sexual freedom. Lots of the narratives that are continuing today around contemporary feminism seem to kind of posit women as these weak, wilting victims. And we've just seen, we've just seen footage celebrating a woman who gave her life to show that she was powerful.
Yeah, it's an interesting analysis, really. I mean, what do you make of it? I mean, the central question that we're posing here, first of all, suffragettes' attitude to feminism and what Ella's said there.
So I think, firstly, it's a really difficult thing to kind of generalise and talk about, considering so many strands of feminism today. But I think, by and large, they'd be so pleased that it's such a widespread topic and that so many women of different generations, particularly young women, though, feel so passionately about feminism today. And, obviously 2018 is a really relevant year to be discussing this because we've had, #MeToo, #TimesUp, and it feels like women's issues are finally being recognised and heard, and people are starting to recognise the really subtle things that have been happening for years in society.
Well, let's throw that Me Too campaign, because this isn't the state intervening in terms of protecting women. This is women taking it forward themselves and saying, we've been silenced for too long about the abuse that's been going on. I mean, do you approve of that, Ella?
I wish that that's what it was, but actually there's been lots of things that have spun out of Me Too that have been, more regulation of women's private lives, women's sexual lives, in terms of there's calls to, I think last time us two were on Sky together, we were talking about the criminalisation of misogyny as a hate crime. So there's the intervention of police into women's lives. That spun out of the whole kind of sexual harassment panic that Me Too has been defined as. But, I mean, crucially, let's take Sylvia Pankhurst, because she's the person that I really want to talk about most today, because she is the radical. Yeah. She was someone who, defined women's suffrage and the fight for women's suffrage in relation to the fight for working class men's suffrage. She was a supporter of the Bolsheviks, she was a radical, she was a revolutionary, and that does not chime with today's feminists.
I see where you're going with this. I mean, radical, so the state gets involved, and in your analysis, Ella, kind of pretends to protect women, but in effect is controlling them, directing them.
I think it's all really relative. At the end of the day, the suffragettes were fighting a huge battle to get women the vote. That was in the context of where they were at the time. And today, we have a completely different set of battles to fight. On paper, in law, we are technically completely equal. But the fights we have to fight today are a lot more subtle. They're the insidious things. They're, the way women are treated in meetings. They're sexual harassment. They're, stressing consent and making sure that young boys and girls are educated about that. And I think, these are the battles that we're fighting today. And I think the suffragettes would want the fight for equality to continue.
I mean, given Ella's analysis, we've got to bring class into this. I mean,
sure.
is this what you're saying? However many women you get into Parliament, if they're from a certain political class, they're going to support that class in spite of their gender, aren't they?
Yeah, and it's been a kind of touchy subject in relation to the coverage today, right across the discussion about the centenary of the vote, is that this wasn't a vote for all women, it was a vote for women over 30 who had property, and crucially, it was the first time that working class men had the vote. So it was very loaded, and Sylvia Pankhurst was not pleased with the kind of limited scope that happened of this vote that happened 100 years ago. I mean, what you just mentioned there in terms of the subtleties of the battles today, those weren't subtle battles 100 years ago. These sexual harassment on a serious and terrible scale, true sexism, brutal sexism, that happened, not just 100 years ago, 50 years ago. Women fought that by demanding their freedom, by being strong-willed, and I, unfortunately, and I'm genuinely disappointed by this, it's not like I'm reveling in the fact that feminism, I think, is failing women. I think it's really unfortunate that we're not grasping that power, that demand, that strength that was so prevalent 100 years ago today.
But I mean, it's the problem, Radhika. I mean, you know, it was very easily defined, wasn't it?
Yeah.
100
that's
more
exactly
years
it,
ago. You don't have a vote, right? So we want to vote. And so many other movements, you know, not necessarily just involving women, have centred around that. One thinks of independence movements and the rest of it. I mean, just develop that thesis that it's just much more subtle now.
Well, exactly. I mean, obviously, you know, as Ella's saying, we have come so far and the battles now are less obvious and in some ways much less horrific than they were back then. But that doesn't mean that we've achieved true equality. I mean, like, you know, I don't really know also how you can say that, you know, that you can suggest that some sexual harassment and some crimes were worse back then than now. We still have horrific sexual crimes. You know, that what Me Too has shown.
Scale is what I'm saying.
Sure, but I mean, at the end of the day, we still have awful reports of rape, violence against women. Helen Pankhurst, who's Sylvia Pankhurst's descendant, said today that one of the biggest issues she thinks women still have is the violence facing them. You know, looking at domestic abuse to sexual violence. And we also have issues like social care, where the burden falls on women. And there are these real, tangible issues that women still need to fight for today.
I just got to ask, Ella, I mean, if the state doesn't get involved to deal with some of those issues, can women police that themselves, or is that the wrong word?
The most exciting thing about the suffragettes 100 years ago was that they were ready to be enemies of the state. They were ready to engage in illegal action and demand things for themselves. You know, we've had discussions today about potentially pardoning them. I think that, as somebody has already said today, would have most of them spinning in their graves. You know, they were radicals. It's certainly Sylvia Pankhurst was a radical. That should be, you know, let's inject some radicalism into the discussion about women's liberation today.
Real food for thought. Radhika, you just want to make one last point?
I mean, the one thing I'd like to say is also that we're forgetting here that the suffragettes and suffragists, you know, there were many different women in this movement who all had different views and different ways of wanting to achieve equality. And I think that's what we see reflected today. You've got, you know, women like Ella who want a sort of more radical feminism, and women like myself who just want to make sure that the government hears our demands and that we do get equality.
Well, listen, brilliant talking to you both and getting both your I was going to say opposing views, but differing views is the right word. Radhika Sangani, Ella Whelan, thank you both very much. Very good to see you. Well, on the eve